Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the colonization of Mars and the Moon.
Woohoo!
So, I'm going to kind of start us off by talking about kind of the colonization of Mars. Obviously, there's lots of companies which are trying to make it viable to get to Mars. Most famously, SpaceX is trying to get there, run by Elon Musk, as well as Richard Branson is trying to get to the moon with his Virgin Media space travel. And there's also some other smaller companies. And also NASA is also trying to look at viable ways to try to live on Mars. They have thought about 3D printing houses and using other techniques like carbon fiber and all these types of stuff to get delivered up to Mars. Quite recently, they held a sort of contest in JPL for all the people, all the inventors trying to build huge 3D printers for the surface of Mars, where they would use kind of the materials that were there on Mars to 3D print these houses made out of Martian rock. And the best design they would see how weatherproof it was by subjecting it to all these different sorts of actions and stuff like that to make sure they get the kind of the best thing, like what's the most viable way. So it's funny to see like the different attitudes that different companies are taking. Like NASA's primarily looking at shelter, whereas SpaceX and Elon is kind of looking at trying to get there and make it viable for sort of recreational travel almost to Mars. It's also quite important to mention that the other day they had their first ever successful manned launch, SpaceX, which kind of started quite an interesting thing.
But don't you think that the colonization of the moon would be a lot more effective, as in it's much closer, and we know lots more about the moon now? In fact, doesn't NASA have a plan to colonize the moon by 2024, and it's a lot more achievable than planet 7 months away instead of a couple of days away?
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah, there is different aspects to look at it. To look at it like that, I think Mars would be a more viable option because it's very similar to Earth in many respects, whereas the moon is very different to Earth because it's not actually a planet in itself. It doesn't have as much gravity. On the moon, they have to use kind of pre-made structures which they bring up, and the atmosphere there is not as similar to Earth as Mars's atmosphere is.
Yeah. Well, the atmosphere on the moon is basically non-existent, which means a sustained colony on the moon would have to be completely within a kind of geodome, which is completely self-sufficient. Whether on Mars, there is some potential for a atmosphere.
Yeah, kind of interesting you brought up the biodome there. You see, the only issue with which people have been seeing with the biodome is they've run a couple of simulations of that in kind of the deserts of America, and they've run 2 so far, both of which have been unsuccessful. The first one was due to concrete poisoning, and that they're worried that all the people in there would be poisoned by the concrete, which part of it was built out of, so they had to end the experiment early. And the second one required outside help after one of the test subjects sliced their hand and needed a medical attention from an outside world and couldn't deal with it themselves. So it's kind of Mars's model is much better to kind of the moon model of a geodome. Do you not agree?
Oh yeah, completely. The moon, while Mars has the possibility and the chance of having life, sustaining life on the planet, the moon is just a rock in space, while Mars has potential, has its own ecosystem. Why, only a couple of years ago, months ago, that they found water could exist in Mars, but way below ground. and that several hundreds of thousands of years ago, that water most likely was on Mars, which does help the any potential for life to grow on Mars. But the moon does have water, and we'd have to live towards the poles. But that is definitely an advantage, especially since Mars, it takes 6 months to get to Mars, while it only takes 3 days to get to the moon, which is completely economically better. If you could send up and come back within a week to moon and back, with Mars it'd take almost a year to get to Mars.
Yeah, just kind of on that, I totally kind of agree with you that the shorter travel is much better. But we can kind of, I think Mars would be slightly better because it actually, if you colonize the moon, there is only so much that you can do up there with kind of, if you have to build these big geodomes or self-sustained habitats up there, which takes quite a while. And if you wanted to kind of create a viable colonization there, it would take quite a long time to kind of set it up. Whereas what kind of NASA are suggesting for their Mars habitats, they'll take about half a day to put up, to print, because they're using 3D printers, and it'll be ready to live in almost immediately. So there's less prep work, even though so perhaps you're actually saving time in the long term of it.
And not to mention just time, but money. I mean, as people say, money makes the world go round. If it's not economically viable to sustain missions to Mars and back, then it's just not going to happen. The moon.
Well, I was just going to say that kind of on the habitats, if with kind of economy, the geodomes that NASA built on the Earth for testing, they cost huge amounts of money to make. Whereas with kind of the ones on Mars, they use the materials on the planet. So it's actually costing less because they don't have to, transport these huge things up into space. They can actually build it while they're there, but it also uses the materials on that planet instead of using materials on the Earth.
Sorry, if I could just intervene there. Where you're talking about it being economically viable and sustainable economically, but obviously with all the kind of depressions and economic crises that are going to come from COVID-19, it does, like, we're probably not going to be able to go for anything near this kind of scale for many years.
Well, yeah, that's actually quite an interesting point there. The current climate at the moment isn't great with kind of the whole COVID situation at the moment, and people are viewing that this kind of space exploration is going to kind of go on hold. So yes, this isn't great for space exploration, but if kind of talking in the future, 50 years rather than 20 years, Jamie mentioned there at the start, they want people on the moon by 2024. Like people living there. I don't think that would be viable with what's going on at the moment. It's probably going to be more like 2030 or maybe even 2035.
Well, to jump in there, I also do think that's true, but I doubt the current situation has that much impact on space travel. Maybe economically, but definitely not by a decade or so. I'd say 2030. Colonization of the moon is entirely possible, not with, obviously, commercially, but with, say, governments sending up their astronauts to live on the moon for a couple of weeks or a day. I feel that's entirely possible. SpaceX saying that they can get a person on Mars in the next 10 years.
But personally, I don't think it would be like the responsible move to make, because we've seen, because of COVID-19, that we're really not even equipped properly to deal with viruses and crises on Earth. Never mind trying to expand outside, because we've seen that our health systems aren't perfect because they weren't able to deal with it properly, and a lot of people have died as a result, and it just doesn't really make sense that we would be trying to expand locations when we can't even properly manage, not even environmentally, but we can't properly manage the society we live in on Earth.
What I was going to say there is you brought up an interesting point about kind of the medical aspect of viruses and stuff. One of the huge issues with colonizing Mars anyway is kind of what viruses could be up there, and actually we still don't even know if there could be a different life form. Obviously it's not proven, and it is quite far-fetched if there is going to be one, but if there is, if we do sort of encounter these by living there, what sort of viruses would humans be subject to? And I mean, it's just kind of, if we can't cope with what's happening on our own planet, it is quite difficult to predict what's going to happen on another.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I have to say that the advantages of exploring space, and especially Mars, completely outweigh the potential. Say there could be hostile life forms, there could be viruses, but what we do know is that there is lots of resources that we don't have enough of on Earth. We do know that it could be a forward base to the world, to the rest of the solar system, and we do know that we could colonize this in the near future. When I say near future, by 2020, 2050, especially definitely by the end of this century, we will have humans, we will have most likely humans, and not cities but colonies on Mars and on the moon. It's just an eventuality, and I think anyone who says anything against that is just standing in the way of progress.
Okay, Jamie, just to go a little bit against that, you say that the potential far outweighs the risks. I don't, you say there's lots of resources, but can you really put a price on the lives that could be saved if we invested all that money into improving outbreaks and healthcare systems and education on Earth? We're investing in all these kind of frivolous pursuits that, like, going into space and doing all these things that aren't really going to help most people. They're not really going to affect people, and they're not going to help the environment on Earth, where we've barely scratched the surface on the potential of solar energy and all these technological developments. So, and also what Jamie was saying, it's standing in the way of development. I disagree with that, because I think we shouldn't stand in the way of development, but we should develop in areas that actually matter.
Well, Sean, without the space race, without humans desperately vying to get to space before each other, we wouldn't have satellites. And satellites have been one of the most major technological advancements over the last couple of decades. They allow us to monitor the world. They allow us to, say, you were talking about climate change. They allow us to monitor the carbon levels in the atmosphere and other gases, and those things do show that the ozone layer has been healing over the last couple of years. I'm pretty sure that your point is pretty null.
I see. I know. Jamie, I do see what you're saying, but you're not really talking about monitoring the Earth more and exploring different areas that would actually affect the Earth. You're kind of talking about seeing, looking for resources on Mars and exploring further out and using Mars as a way out.
In the first place, in the 1960s, saying we can get to space. Without their vision of getting to space, we wouldn't have satellites today. And that's what I'm talking about. If we try and get to Mars, who knows in 20 years' time what technological advancements we would have because of that. GPS was invented by the US military to get one over on the USSR. Who knows what technology will be invented in the next couple of years or next couple of decades that will help not only us get to Mars, but help us in our day-to-day lives.
Just on that, Jamie.
Well, that's the potential, but we see issues, on Earth, because you're saying that, maybe if we go out to space, then, there's a chance that we're going to discover something new that's going to help us on our daily lives. But we see, issues today that we know
Well,
need investment, we know
Dion,
need improvement, rather than looking
just
for, new things, new
just kind of
developments. We should fix what we have. Sorry,
on
Fraser.
that
Go on.
front though, yeah. You say that we would be going up there to search for the possibility of something that's going to make us better, but the Earth better. But we know that there is stuff on Mars that could benefit us on Earth. There is countless resources on Mars that we could use for power, for all that sort of stuff on Mars, as well as kind of what Jamie was saying with the technology, is that if we somehow create how to deal with kind of medical issues up on Mars and so up on Mars or on the moon or something like that, if we could then use that on Earth, which would actually improve the medical systems on Earth, which we know at the moment is severely lacking. So I think the space exploration isn't just helping space exploration, it's helping the world as a whole.
But can you give an example of what resources that can be found in Mars? Because, we have kind of barely scratched the surface of Mars exploration, so we don't really know much. But I don't know
Well, if
any resources that would be
as
helpful, but
so
maybe you
many
do.
of these minerals and stuff, it just stands to reason that other planets would have the same.
Exactly.
And
yes, it does. But would you not agree, if we invested however many hundreds of millions or even billions we would put into space exploration, if we put that into, solar energy, which, as I said, we barely know anything about,
but kind
that
of
could be a lot more effective.
On that front, though, you could say the exact same thing for military spending. Like the US spends a huge amount of money on their military, but a fraction, like a complete fraction of that on NASA. And so if you're kind of bringing up this point of money, would we not take away this kind of this hostility towards each other and kind of we should really create a better future together rather than against each other. Instead of cutting funding for kind of space exploration, we should cut funding to the hostilities, to the things that we don't need really to be fighting each other. We should be kind of united in the front of protecting the human race and kind of seeking a different planet. Do you not really agree with that?
I do agree, and if it's something that could, but there's, if you're looking for something that can unite us as a race, then, or as a species, even, then, there are so many other things that we could work towards that would actually benefit us. And I see what you're saying about cutting military spending, but and I do agree with that. But I just see space exploration as another sort of hole that people are putting money in, and I agree that military spending is another one of them. I think space exploration is just adding to that.
Well, to add to Fraser's point, if you were going to get rid of something that did not benefit humanity, obviously the military spending of the United States and the world is completely outrageous and it's completely unnecessary. We live
and I think that's even worse than the spending on space exploration
period of time throughout the world, and really spending that much amount of money on the military is completely unacceptable when it doesn't help anyone within the United States or within the world. But what does help them, what could help them, and what will help them in the future is space exploration and the technology that comes about from that. So I think your point there is completely null and void.
I just kind of on that, Jamie, I totally agree with that. But then I suppose we can't really overlook what would be the issue of the militarization of space, which has been they've had to create a whole UN sub body for this. That it's such a huge issue that a country could militarize the moon or could militarize Mars or just militarize space in general. And so, I mean, that's another issue to kind of look at with space exploration, is that should we really solve the issues of kind of a war on our own planet before we go and start destroying other planets with war? Does anyone kind of...
I don't think, now personally, like, I know this kind of goes against what I'm trying to bring forward, but I don't think that's really a reason to not think about exploring space in itself, because I think humans, no matter where we go or whatever places we discover, we're always going to try and benefit in some way or other from that. Even if that is, is a disadvantage for people around us, or for for the environment in other places. I think if we managed what we did outside of Earth responsibly, and I don't think that would be a real issue. And I think we see that on Earth, and I think that's everywhere, where humans just trying to get the upper hand on other people.
Yeah.
Well, I think that space and the colonization of space has potential to work out something more like the Antarctic Treaty and the Space Treaty are very similar. Both say there's no exploitation for one country's benefit, no militarization. So I think it could be that there is some level of cooperation. Now, not that no one will make any claims to any parts of the moon or Mars. I think we're too early for that, but definitely in the next couple of decades, countries most likely will stake claims to them, to parts of the moon and Mars, especially the places where they first land. I can definitely see there being, Chinese sectors of the moon, or British or EU sectors of the moon. I think that's extremely possible, and in fact most likely probable. There's no way that humans are going to share the moon and Mars, even though there is a treaty in place. I feel that they definitely won't say it publicly, or this is part of America, but there's definitely colonies.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. But you mentioned there the treaty with the Arctic and stuff like that. You see, the thing is, what the issue with the Arctic is, the resources there is that some countries are trying to lay claim to that what is in the Arctic is ours. We deserve these resources. And this could happen on a much larger scale on Mars, because there is quite a few minerals that we could use on Mars. And would this, like, the Arctic is much smaller in comparison to Mars, obviously. So would we just have this huge issue of countries laying claim to the materials on that planet are ours, no one else can have them?
Yeah, and I think that will only add to, the advantage for countries who are willing to spend anything on, gaining the upper hand. Like, take the United States, with the amount of money they are spending on military and, things that aren't really going to benefit the people. I think this is just going to be another way for countries to divert their spending in ways that, the common person isn't going to gain anything from.
Well,
Yeah.
The common person might not gain anything in the immediate second or the next year, but as I said earlier, in the next couple of years, all of humanity will benefit. I feel it's actually kind of a bit selfish of you there, if you don't mind me saying, well, why don't they give us all the money? Why wouldn't? Because
I'm not saying us, but I'm saying there are thousands of homeless people in our streets, and there are people dying of diseases that should be able to be cured if we invested money into researching them. So I think it's kind of the other way around. Whereas you're saying, oh yeah, all of humanity may benefit, but there are people right now starving and dying of diseases that should be preventable all around the world. So I don't think you can really say that without, you know, thinking of those people.
The thing is, though, is that wherever humans go, and wherever species goes, there's always going to be issues. There's especially kind of with the human model, there's always going to be homelessness. There's always going to be disease and stuff. And
yeah, but with the amount of money you're talking about,
but you see, the thing is, the amount of money that actually goes into space travel, especially with NASA, is actually a fraction of kind of what medical centers get and stuff like that. Obviously, kind of SpaceX is a privately run thing, so even if they weren't trying to put people on Mars, Elon would be spending that money in some other way. He wouldn't be giving it out to homeless people. He would.
No, but he might be developing, you know, more, you know, because he does electric cars. He could be making them more efficient. He could be, you know, finding resources such as the cobalt, which exploits child workers in Congo. Yeah, and that's damaging their lungs and their respiratory systems. And I think, yeah, I disagree with why he's spending that. I don't see the major benefit.
You mentioned solar panels earlier, but solar panels technology. You said solar panels. It's like, why are they investing in space? They should be investing on better.
I said they should. Yeah, they should be investing on improving them because we barely scratched the surface. Because solar energy is the most abundant and powerful we know.
Exactly, but that's not possible.
Solar panels.
Yeah, we have invested in space exploration, and we learn more about how the sun and the radiation works for experiments, say, on the ISS.
No, but even like, so solar panels themselves came from space exploration. Solar panels didn't exist until until satellites required them to function. So
yeah, because it was a necessity for them. So yeah, exactly. I'm not really saying.
So if we didn't have space exploration, like it is constantly making the Earth better. Like soon, NASA have they're investing in more efficient solar panels for their satellites for the ISS, for example,
which makes it cheaper.
Which makes it cheaper. And yeah, so we're soon going to get much cheaper kind of solar panels. We're going to get wind power is going to be cheaper. All of this is going to be cheaper because these companies, they're trying to adapt stuff for space exploration, but it still works on our own planet. And we wouldn't have solar panels if we didn't have the space race. So it's kind of
really.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's kind of necessary for the human race to keep expanding. It's what the human race does. When back in the age of exploration, nobody was happy with just living in Europe. They wanted to discover America. They wanted to discover
and that
Africa.
led to the extermination of other peoples, such as the Native Americans, who are almost been almost completely wiped out.
Quality of life.
Yeah. It improved the quality of life of everyone.
For the people who did get killed, yes.
Exactly, but
it wasn't. It was an accidental plague. We didn't.
It wasn't really but you can say it's accidental, but it was also the taking of their land, and the evacuating. Supposedly,
it is an argument for another day. It is an argument for another day. The ethics of the age of exploration. But it's just kind of that thing, that the sense that humans have to keep that drive to keep exploring. They want to always kind of expand their knowledge. And I think that is why space is that sort of is the next frontier. It's the one that everybody wants to discover. So it is actually constantly bettering the human race.
Yeah, I agree with Fraser. And to say that is space exploration worth the time and effort and the tens of billions that a government spend on this effort, there isn't really a yes or no. everything in life
Exactly,
is
yeah.
grey, but I feel that there is more reasons for than there is against this endeavour.
You see, the thing is, the only thing that I would think is quite contradictory for space exploration is the fact that 70% of our planet is unexplored. The ocean, nobody really knows the entirety of what's down below the surface of the Earth, like in oceans and stuff like that. So that it is quite contradictory that they're thinking we're going to, be the next frontier. We're going to search for new planets where we haven't actually really discovered everything in our own planet.
Yeah.
Well, as contradictory as it might seem, it is actually easier to go to the moon than it is to go basically to the bottom of the Mariana Trench or to dig 2 kilometers down in Earth. I mean, it's a lot more. It's not cheaper, and it's a lot less loss of human lives. I mean, we can't go that much further into the Earth without the pressure completely killing us all.
Well, space exploration is a very kind of complicated thing, and I don't think anybody would really kind of understand what is the true kind of determination of what's good or bad about it. But I think it is majoritively positive from my view. Does it, like, I know, Fionn, you do have some conflicting kind of views about it. Do you want to say anything about kind of like what you think kind of determines? Like, obviously you said that we could put all the money into helping the Earth, helping people on the Earth. So do you want to kind of just...
Well, I think you gave a really interesting answer there about how much, for instance, the US spends on military, and then in comparison the space exploration costs aren't massive. I think what you said there is right, and I think space exploration.
I have some figures here about
I think space exploration, it's better to be spending money on that than on military, but I don't think it's really a priority that we should be investing so much, because I think there are just so many issues in the world at the moment, and I see, and I agree that there's much more to be gained from it than from military spending, and I also, disagree with the amount of money being spent on on arms, but I just think space exploration is just another thing that isn't really going to get us very far very quickly when there are so many issues that we have that could be fixed a lot quicker on Earth.
Exactly, but there's kind of something that we did kind of overlook in this bit is the thought that, do humans really sort of deserve a second chance? If we look at what we have actually done to our own planet of Earth, do we really want to do that to the moon, to Mars, or even other planets in the future? Do we want to ruin them? Do we want to completely kind of, like, do we deserve a second chance, essentially?
I would say so. I mean, like, saying humans is a second chance, I feel, is a completely oversimplification. I mean, like, no one's giving humans a second chance. Humans are taking a second chance. No one's going to say, sorry, we don't give you your permission. I mean, like, humans, if they want to do something as a race, we are going to do
it. They will do
it. And as opposed to the ethical issues of destroying a planet, if we could perhaps not, like, say, still live on Earth, but completely destroy other planets, because who's going to care if it's just a mining colony on Mars? Like, there's too many people going to be opposing that.
Yeah. And I kind of agree with Jamie on that point, because in fairness, there's very little life. Like, I mean, there's bacteria and stuff that can be found outside of Earth, but as far as we know, there aren't even really plants in Mars, so there's not a whole lot to be destroyed apart from the beautiful kind of the look of them, but there's very little life that would be damaged or harmed.
Well, I think that kind of signifies the end of today's topic. So
we finish up with a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous astrologist. Here we go. Sums up the argument in favor exploration for me. I think you just let me listen to talk about this, and we'll just finish up. So this is a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Let's imagine we're all back in the cave. So go back into that cave. We're sitting around the fire, and someone's injured or has a problem, and someone says, I want to go across that meadow to the mountain. Maybe there's something there. The other people say in the cave, no, we can't leave the cave until we solve the cave problem first. We have to solve those problems first before anyone leaves the cave. I mean, to me, this is completely self-explanatory and kind of embodies the entire point of space exploration. Don't you guys agree?
Yeah,